It's music theory online. Let's learn some theory online by watching modules online with music theory online.
Hello everyone and welcome to Junior Theory. Like you, my own theory students have a hard time fitting another weekly lesson into their already busy schedule, which is why I developed Music Theory Online. In our first module, we'll begin building on what you have already learned in the Beginning Theory course. As with all of the levels, I'm here to help you every step of the way. We're in this together. Don't forget that we've also have our weekly theory club, which is where you can ask any and all questions. There's nothing new in our first module in Junior Theory. We're just going to review some of the things that you already know. We'll be reviewing lines and spaces, the grand staff, why middle C is the way it is, and we'll also review bar lines, clef signs, ledger lines, and accidentals. Of course, we need to know about accidentals in order to write chromatic and diatonic half steps or semitones. We'll also review whole tones and enharmonic notes as well. Here we see an example of early notation. It often helps us understand our own notation system when we look back and see where notation began. In this slide, you can see some red lines that would indicate whether the pitch would be higher or lower. The squares and triangles represented specific notes, and the little V's also represented a specific treatment of the note or group of notes. It was very difficult to know exactly what the composer intended the music to sound like. It really was a combination of the oral tradition, which means the performers had heard the music a number of times before, and it was also the beginning of the written tradition. By having the music written down, the performers were able to learn more music because now they had a written form to help them remember how the music went. Doesn't the great staff look so much easier to read than the earlier notational styles? The first written staff was only 4 lines. This great staff you're viewing now has 11 lines. That really made this staff very difficult to read. At some point in history, the full line where middle C is found was removed. The space was increased between the treble clef and the bass clef, and a ledger line was used for middle C. This small change made it much easier to read the great or grand staff. See how much easier this is to read with the middle C line taken out? That's why today we must add a ledger line when notating middle C. You can also see on this slide how the grand staff matches the notes on the keyboard. It's so simple. The lower the notes are on the grand staff, the lower the notes are on the piano. The higher the notes are on the grand staff, the higher they are on the piano. How simple is that? When you move from a line to a space, or a space to a line, you also move up or down 1 key on the keyboard. It's all very logical. We're all very familiar with bar lines because we see them all the time in our music. A single bar line is used to organize our notes and rests into bars or measures. A double bar line is used between sections of music to indicate a break. The final double bar line has a thick line and a thin line. This means that you have finished the piece or the movement. Many years ago, the treble clef was written as the letter G. Notice how the treble clef has evolved from the early letter G to the treble clef as we know it today. The G clef is where the treble clef makes the circle. It almost looks like a note on the G line, which is why it's often called the G clef. The bass clef was originally an F. Notice how the 2 dots are above and below the F line. The beginning of the bass clef also circles around the F line. It's easy to see why the bass clef is sometimes called the F clef. There are many notes that cannot fit on the grand staff. That's why we have ledger lines. Ledger lines extend the grand staff as high or as low as necessary. Ledger lines are only added for the specific note. You never add any additional ledger lines. The distance between the ledger lines is similar to that of the staff. The spaces are not larger and they're not smaller. The first group of ledger lines we see are called outer ledger lines because they extend the staff higher. The lower notes are called inner ledger lines because they extend the staff down into the bass clef range. Notice that lines are not added above or below ledger line space notes. The first group of these ledger line notes are called inner ledger lines because they extend the bass clef up into the treble clef range. The second group of notes are called the outer ledger lines because they extend the bass clef lower. Here's a great tip to remember. The second ledger line in the treble clef and the second ledger line in the bass clef are both C. In the bass clef we have middle C, then C in a space number 2, which is often called bass C, and then we have low C, which is the second ledger line. In the treble clef we have middle C, space 3C, which is often called treble C, and high C, which is the second ledger line. Knowing where these ledger line C's are on the grand staff make naming outer ledger line notes so much easier because you can begin by counting the notes from those ledger line C landmarks. Here's some helpful tips on writing ledger lines. Ensure your ledger lines look like an extension of the staff. Make sure that the ledger lines are a little wider than your notes so that they can be seen. Each note must have its own ledger line. You cannot make a solid ledger line and have more than one note. Use only the ledger lines you need. If the ledger line is a space ledger line, you're not going to add an extra line above or below it. If the space note is on a ledger line above the treble clef staff or above the bass clef staff, you would not add a line above that space note. If the space note is on a ledger line below the treble clef staff or below the bass clef staff, you would not add a line below the space note. For space ledger line notes, the last thing you see is the note, not a line, just the note. Let's look at these examples. The space notes have nothing above them. The same applies for the second example. Remember your second ledger line landmarks. In the bass clef and the treble clef, the second ledger line is always C. These two important landmarks are going to make counting ledger lines so much easier. Let's review accidentals. Think of an accidental as a temporary note change for one pitch for the duration of one measure. Accidentals can lower or raise notes by a half step or a semitone. Remember that a half step or a semitone is the smallest distance between any two notes. It's important to use only the accidentals that are absolutely necessary. And remember that the accidental only affects that pitch for that one measure. If you change from a sharp to a flat or a flat to a sharp within the same measure, you can go directly to that sharp or flat. You don't really need to write a natural. Let's review what an enharmonic note is. The simplest way of describing enharmonic notes is that it's the same key with a different name. Remember, the black keys don't have names of their own. They have to borrow their names from the white keys. That means most black keys have two names. They can be either a sharp or a flat. When you look at this slide, we can see that C sharp and D flat are enharmonic notes. They sound the same but have a different letter name. D sharp and E flat are enharmonic notes. So is F sharp and G flat. Careful though, because between E and F, as well as B and C, we don't have a black key. That means that E and F flat are enharmonic, as well as F and E sharp. The same thing happens between B and C. B and C flat are enharmonic notes. C and B sharp are enharmonic as well. Remember that the sharp sign raises the pitch of a note by a half step or a semitone. Because the sharp raises a note by a half step or semitone, it means some sharps can actually be on white keys. For example, when you raise B to B sharp, it's the enharmonic twin of C. When you raise E to E sharp, it's the same as F. A flat lowers the pitch by a half step or semitone. So when C becomes C flat, it's the harmonic equivalent of B. When F becomes F flat, it's the harmonic equivalent of E. The natural sign cancels out any previous sharp or flat in the given measure. A natural can also cancel a sharp or a flat that's in the key signature, but only for that measure. Remember that the bar line cancels out any accidentals in that measure. In the example you see, the first F is sharp. The next F in the same measure would also be sharp because the accidental sharp carries for the whole measure. The last note in the second measure of this example is an F natural because the bar line cancels out the previous sharp. In the second measure, we have an A flat. The second A has a natural sign in front of it which cancels out the flat. When you play this, the first A is flat and the second A is natural on the white key. Let's just review some of the hints for accidentals. Always write the accidental in front of the note. Otherwise, you'll have played the note before you realize it has been altered. Remember, the accidental affects the entire measure unless you change it or cancel it with a natural. Accidentals only affect the one pitch that you give it. In the example you see, the first F is sharp. Therefore, the second F is also sharp because it's in the same pitch. The third F in this first measure would be F natural because it's a different pitch. In the second measure, the first F would be natural. The second F that has the sharp in front of it would of course be sharp. The last F would be natural because it's a different pitch. A bar line always cancels all accidentals. Only use the necessary and fewest number of accidentals you need. In this example, the second F sharp does not need an accidental because the first F already has the sharp, which carries to the next F. When you change a note from a sharp to a flat, you'll need to add a natural sign. Let's go over this example and see what is sharp, flat, and natural. The first B is flat. Remember, the accidental must always be written in front of the note. The second B is natural, so a natural sign is written in front of that B to cancel out the previous B flat. The A, G, F, and F are as written. The second last F is F sharp. Again, notice the accidental is written before the note. Those last two Fs are sharp. Do you remember what a diatonic semitone is? It's simply a semitone that uses a different letter name. The first measure has F to G flat. That's a diatonic half step or semitone because it has a different letter name. A to G sharp is also a diatonic semitone or half step because it has different letter names. A sharp to B is also a diatonic semitone because it has a different letter name. Not all diatonic semitones have an accidental, though. B to C is a diatonic half step or semitone because there's no black key between the B and C. Likewise, F to E or E to F are also diatonic half steps or semitones. It's easiest to always use a keyboard so you can ensure the distance is a semitone or half step and not a tone. A chromatic half step or semitone has the same or common letter name. Remember that common and chromatic Both start with the letter C. B to B sharp is a chromatic semitone because it has a common letter name. Of course, you could call B sharp C and you'd play it on the same place on the piano. However, we would call this a diatonic semitone. F to F flat is also a chromatic semitone because it has a common letter name. It's the same for G to G sharp and B to B flat. These have a common letter name, therefore they are chromatic semitones. If you called the G sharp A flat, then it would be a diatonic semitone. Or if you called the B flat A sharp, then it would be a diatonic semitone. It's kind of cool how these semitones sound the same, but they have a different name depending on what you call that second note. Let's see if we can find the diatonic semitone or half step for the notes on the screen. Our first note is D. If we want to write a diatonic semitone above D, the letter E must be involved. When we look at the keyboard and move a half step or semitone above D, we have two choices, either D sharp or E flat. Because we're writing a diatonic semitone, we must have a different letter name. Therefore, we would need to write E flat. So the answer would be E flat. If we wanted to write a diatonic half step below D, we would first need to look at the keyboard to see what the black key would be in this case. The question is, what are we going to call that note? Again, we have two choices, either C sharp or D flat. If we want a diatonic semitone, we must have a different letter name. So, of course, it would have to be C sharp. In the second example, we have the note G. If we go above the G to find a diatonic half step or semitone, we know the name would be either G sharp or A flat. Because we need a different name, the correct answer would be A flat. If we go below G, our choice would be G flat or F sharp. Again, because we need a different letter name, the answer would have to be F sharp. See if you can work out what a diatonic semitone above and below C would be. Just pause this module while you work it out. Did you work it out? A diatonic half step or semitone above C would be D flat. A diatonic half step or semitone below C would be B. This next example is a little trickier. A diatonic half step above B flat would be C flat. A diatonic half step below B flat would be A. What would the diatonic semitone be above E? Did you figure it out? It would be F. A diatonic semitone below E would be D sharp. Now let's move on to some chromatic semitones. Remember that a chromatic semitone has a common letter name. Our first note is D. A chromatic semitone above D would have to have the same or common letter name. When we moved a half step above D, we have two choices, either D sharp or E flat. In order for it to be a chromatic semitone, the answer would be D sharp. If we go a semitone or half step below D, again we have two choices. We can call the semitone either C sharp or D flat. Remember, it must have the same letter name, therefore the answer would be D flat. A chromatic semitone above G would be G sharp. We couldn't call it A flat because it must have a common or the same letter name. A chromatic semitone or half step below G would be G flat. Can you figure out a chromatic semitone above C? It would have to be C sharp, wouldn't it? A chromatic semitone below C would be C flat. Although it's the same as B, we would have to call it C flat in order for it to be a chromatic half step or semitone. What would be a chromatic half step above A? it would be A sharp. Again, we need the same or the common letter name. A chromatic half step or semitone below A would be A flat. A whole tone is simply 2 half steps or 2 semitones. All you need to do is to remember to skip a key. C to D is a whole tone because there's a black key in the middle. D to E is also a whole tone because there's a black key between them. E to F sharp is a whole tone because there's a white key between the 2 notes. You can also have whole tones between black keys. F sharp to G sharp is a whole tone because there's a white key between the 2 black keys. Always remember that whole tones must be diatonic. They must have a different letter name, and the letter name is always consecutive. It's always C to D or D to E. You can't skip a letter. Let's see if these notes are chromatic semitones, diatonic semitones, and harmonic notes or whole tones. In the first example, we have D to E flat. Of course, we know it can't be a chromatic semitone because it has a different letter name. When we look on the keyboard, we see that D to E flat is a half step or a semitone, and it has a different letter name, so it's a diatonic semitone. In the next example, we have E to F. Again, it cannot be a chromatic semitone because it has a different letter name. When we look at the keyboard, we see that E to F is a half step or semitone, and it has a different letter name, so it's a diatonic semitone. G to F also cannot be a chromatic semitone. When we look at the keyboard, we see that there's a black key between the G and the F. That means this is a whole tone or a whole step. C to B also cannot be chromatic because it has different letter names, so it's also a diatonic semitone. G to A is a whole tone because there's a black key in between those 2 notes. E to F is also a diatonic semitone, and A to A flat is a chromatic semitone. Let's just review some of the concepts that we've covered. A semitone or a half step is the shortest distance between any 2 notes. A chromatic semitone is going to have the same letter name. Chromatic and common both start with C. Diatonic semitones have a different letter name. Diatonic and different both start with D. A tone is 2 half steps or semitones, and there's always a key in between. And harmonic notes have the same sound but different letter names. A sharp raises the notes by a semitone and a flat lowers a note by a semitone. Remember to get your assignments finished and send them in to me so I can mark them. We're in this together, and I'm here to help you every step of the way. I look forward to seeing you at Theory Club this week. Have a super-duper week.
It's music theory online. Let's learn some theory online by watching modules online with music theory online.